Hello, everybody, and welcome back to NASMARB Garage Pass. This is our 8th episode, and we are headed full speed on towards the playoffs of NASMARB Season 2. We just completed the Malbao 400 from Spiral Speedway, the 7th race out of 8 in the regular season, and we're about to dive in, provide a lot of analysis headed towards the playoffs. But first, we got to introduce our analysts. As always, it's Luke and Sham.
Nice to see you again.
Happy to be here for the 8th episode.
We are going to jump right into the results, and there's a lot to talk about from this race, especially in terms of points, as we have only one more race in the regular season to determine the 12 drivers of the playoffs. And we got off to a really quick start, a really interesting start, and it started with qualifying, which typically is pretty tame, but speeds were down, and we had a DNF in qualifying from one driver. That was Woodpecker, and Woodpecker was right on the line. He was 1 point in the playoffs over Spitzer, and then Spitzer didn't make the race. And so the two right on the cut line, 1 point in, 1 point out, both missed the race and left the door wide open for everyone below the line to gain a ton of points heading into our final race. Unfortunately, Mozilla and Prime weren't really able to make up any ground, and they really needed it, as they are at the bottom of the standings right now and finished 18th and 17th respectively. Sal has really been struggling. He finished in 16th and also wasn't really able to gain much. Electro, who was in just barely in the playoffs, finished in 15th. Quillo in 14th. Streamer in 13th was the last of the cars to not advance into the final 12. Confetti entered below the line and did advance from the groups, but ultimately was unable to advance any further and finished 12th. Nugget, who was also below the line, finished in 11th. And so that kind of was a theme outside of a couple of drivers. Pretty much everyone below the line didn't take huge advantage of those DNQs, but it still made it a lot closer with Spitzer and Woodpecker not making the race. On to our top 10, it started with Lemon Drizel and Oak finishing 10th and 9th. Winks is a storyline going forward, which is crazy, and we'll get into him a little bit later, but he finished in 8th, another solid finish for that 13 team. Piper continues her strong season, finishing in 7th. Our final 6 was Neptune, who finished in 6th, Steve finishing in 5th from the pole once again, Jack Tato finishing 4th, and our finals was Earl in the 33 finishing in 3rd, and Misfortune Racing having a very good race, with Murakami finishing in 2nd in this race for the 2nd year in a row, and Bloodstorm claiming his first career victory at Spiral Speedway.
Boy, this was a very interesting race. I think this is probably one of the best races that I personally have ever seen. I don't know about you two, but the aggression in this race was very high. You saw a ton of blocking between so many different drivers, and it was mainly towards all of the playoff drivers. Now, I don't know if this is a sign of things to come, but these guys are really ramping it up before we get into the playoffs. Just some really interesting highlights that I saw was Steve during the Steve and Nugget final 12 appearance. Steve pulled off two really great blocks on Nugget. The one to prevent him from scoring the first point after Nugget came up and kind of dumped him, and then Steve went ahead and quickly swept him. Then during the Oak and Murakami matchup, Oak pulled off a last second block on Murakami to at least have a chance to advance into the final 6. And then teammates at it once again, specifically at Red Pandas Racing. Drizel and Earl just cannot seem to stay away from each other, but these two continuously going at it, and Drizel uh, drew a pretty good block on Earl to at least try to gain back the advantage towards him. But overall, the final 12 was filled with a ton of action. And something to note is that 4 out of 6 of those final 12 matchups were not sweeps. So I think this race was a very competitive sign of things to come as we head up to the playoffs.
Yeah, it was certainly a very great race from basically all of the drivers at the top there. A lot of them were very close matchups, but one of the teams you wouldn't really think have done well, but it was more Misfortune Racing. Um, as stated, Bloodstorm was kind of in on points already, but this win greatly helps him. It boosts him all the way up to the fourth seed overall. But huge for Murakami, as stated, as the Woodpecker and Spitzer D and Qing. He was really the only one to take the massive advantage from that, getting a second place, shooting all the way from I think like negative 18ish to now plus 15. So a lot of there from Murakami. So great to see from him.
And yeah, you talk about Misfortune Racing. I mean, what a race! Not just from Bloodstorm and Murakami, but also Winx as well. I mean, uh, Misfortune Racing as a whole amassed 21 heat wins between those three drivers, and 19 of those heat wins were between Bloodstorm and Murakami, who ended up finishing 1-2 in this race. Winx, obviously lagging behind between those two, but still, another great top 10 effort considering the season that Winx had. I don't think I've ever seen Misfortune Racing perform that well. And so I really do hope that they continue to keep up this momentum going forward.
Yeah, and this is a good thing to see from Misfortune. They had been having a really tough season up until really a couple of races ago when Winx turned it around just last week at DDT with a surprising fourth place effort. But there's also Murakami, who obviously really surged at the end of last year after the insert switch with Winx. But it looks like he may be on that same trajectory this season, finishing second, and there is no switching this season. This is the same equipment he's been running all year. Same thing for Winx. Same equipment he's been running all season, and suddenly here at the end of the season, he's finding himself only 14, 15 points out of the playoffs right now. That is doable in the final race of the season if he can show up again. So it's a good sign for Misfortune and their alliance member Fortune Racing. Going into the final race. Obviously, they're going to have some drivers that miss, but it's certainly possible for at least 3 of those 5 who are in that alliance to make it. And looking at this final, first of all, that was a tremendous final. I'd say one of the best that we've seen in all 15 races of the regular season in NASMARB across both seasons. Just really competitive driving. It was Earl finishing in third, Murakami second, and Bloodstorm got the win. Luke, what did you see from our third place finisher Earl this week?
I mean, Earl, I think, is still continuing to impress everyone. He still finds himself always somewhere around Drizel, but this time, once again, he's able to best him and prevent him from having a chance at the win. Another solid, not really quiet, but more so solid, a strong race from Earl, making it to another finale where he's actually tied with his teammate Drizel with 3 finale appearances. So I think that's something to tip your hat off for Earl.
Yeah, and I think Earl, he's been kind of if you remember last season, Electro seemed kind of forgotten on OB Racing because Streamer was flashy and that really the top guy. Where you have Drizel on Red Pandas Racing is certainly the top guy and the one everyone talks about. Earl's kind of going under the radar, but maybe picking up some things from his teammate. As you mentioned, the aggressive driving and the blocking that we saw throughout this race, he did a really clean block in the second heat of the final that was very reminiscent of something that Drizel would have done. He made a move and just cut off Murakami to ultimately to tie it at that point in heat wins. And so I think that maybe he's seeing some of the techniques that the 3 is using, and he's putting those into use, and he's getting further and further into these races, really showing up this season. And I would say certainly is right now second on that team of the 4.
Speaking for our second place in the race, Murakami, I kind of touched on it last week when we were talking about the standings, but I said during that time that Murakami was getting a bit unlucky in facing Drizel in the final 12 stages, and this time he faced Oak. And what I said last time was that Oak has actually beaten Drizel 2 races in a row, so I think it's actually very interesting to note that Murakami then defeated Oak this time in a very spectacular final 12 heat. It was very impressive from both of them, but Murakami was able to take the win there and keep going. Easily his best performance so far this season, and I think it I think it really is important to note that, yeah, nothing has been changed about Murakami, but now that we're at race 7 going to race 8, I think this is just his strong suit at the end here to just race really hard, and it's all he really needs at the end.
And yeah, a lot of credit is due to Murakami. Not he's not been, the most explosive driver, I think, this year compared to a lot of other drivers, but I think Murakami's been a little bit stronger than what he was since last year. And coupling that with yet again another strong performance here at the seventh race, turning up the wick right at the right moment as well, vaulting himself up into the playoff hunt. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough to dethrone Bloodstorm, the eventual winner of the race. Honestly, Bloodstorm ran probably one of the most cleanest races that I've seen at all. The only majorly aggressive move that he made was to block Piper in the final 12 matchup. And we all know Piper is infamously known for racing very aggressive. So, Bloodstorm did what he had to do, to fight fire with fire. And he was able to end a 14 race drought to make it to the finale that happened all the way back in the second race of season 1. It's been that long since Bloodstorm has even had a chance at a win, and he was finally able to have a very clean, very professional first win of his career.
I think Bloodstorm has really been one of the most consistent drivers in the series, and I think he's overlooked because he hadn't gotten that win. And now that he's finally broken through, you see it all the time. Somebody struggles to get a first win, and then once they get it, they kind of break out. And I'd be interested to see if Bloodstorm continues this into the end of this season and going forward into season 3 after now he's gotten his first win. And maybe he's kind of on the radar for a lot of people now after finally getting that win. It seems unbelievable that this was only his second finals appearance with how consistent he's been. But that just shows, what kind of driver he is, and he's always there, and he finally took advantage of that opportunity this weekend. Speaking of winners, let's review your race picks from last week. Starting with our favorites, we had Streamer for Luke. What did you see from Streamer this weekend? He got out in the group stage.
Well, Streamer actually had some pretty good speed during the qualifying. He qualified fifth, which is his career best qualifying effort. So I thought my prediction was going to hold true that stats don't matter. But unfortunately, he and his teammate were unceremoniously eliminated after the group stage. I don't know if that was just, they were way off on the setup or just the Malbao curse, because, both cars representing Malbao ended up getting out in the Malbao sponsored race. So just a very unfortunate, early exit for Streamer. Just nothing much more than that.
It was certainly a disappointing race for the Malbao cars for sure, with both of them going out in the group stage, like you said. Shem, your favorite to win this race was Lemon Drizel. He finished 10th place in this race. What have you been seeing from Lemon Drizel here recently?
I think we kind of might just be correct on what we were talking about last week, where Drizel's just kind of racing out there to more so spectate on his opponents because he's more or less locked in as the number 1 seed. He's by far in the lead of overall points, but in the past few weeks, he's kind of just had consistent top 10 efforts, but as 10th place. But I mean, it's nothing bad to say from Drizel, but it is definitely interesting seeing him losing to his teammate Earl, so that might be a few concerns in the playoffs, or he just wanted to see his partner do a little bit better.
And for your underdog pick, you had another Red Pandas Racing driver, which was Piper, and Piper finished in 7th this week at Spiral.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that they did not come back from their previous race 1 performance. They weren't as good qualify seeded this time. They were only 10th, which is halfway through, not their top 5, which they had last time. But it is interesting that they did end up losing to Bloodstorm in the final 12, so maybe that played a factor in them not doing as well. But I think Piper definitely could have had a shot to do a bit better, but because it is shown that they did end up in seventh, so they had one win and was the fastest of all those winners. So they definitely had the qualities to maybe get to the final six or a finals appearance, but just cut short by the race winner this time.
Definitely. And Piper actually, the heat win that she got in the first heat of that final 12 matchup, actually got a fastest lap for that, and was a really dominant first run, and then Bloodstorm won 2 in a row. But fair point definitely to say that, lost to the winner, and if you're going to lose to anyone, you want it to be whoever ends up going on to get the win. So nothing to hang her head about. She does drop 1 point in the one spot in the standings, but still a solid effort for Piper. And Luke, you were really bold with the picks last week, and you went with Winx as your underdog. And look at Winx, 8th place and a second best finish of the season.
Well, yeah, I mean, Winx definitely has turned a corner, I think, and you know, if it's if it's to be told that he'll eventually make the playoffs, we'll see. But Winx, he tied his best career qualifying effort at Hyper with the 7th place finish, and he actually did have a fastest lap during the race as well, which was his personal best of the entire session. And if you compare it with the qualifying times that we saw, it was actually the 7th fastest time that he had put up. So a very strong effort yet again from Winx.
Yeah, it was just over that lap you're talking about was just over 4 seconds, which was a very solid time if you compare it to qualifying, and it makes it even better that it happened during the group stage in the race. So he really showed up when he needed to, and was able to advance and put himself in a spot to potentially come out of nowhere and claim the final spot in the playoffs. And speaking on the playoffs and who could be in or out, let's review our overall standings going into our final race. We have a lot of locks going on in this race. So we'll start with our first one who locked their way into the playoffs. It was the winner, Bloodstorm, who was pretty good in points regardless, but he is locked into the playoffs. The other one's locked in now. Drizel with his 2 wins, Earl with his win is now up into second place in overall points. Piper has been locked in on points. Steve has been locked in on points. Neptune with the 2 wins locked in as well. And Oak is our final driver, locked in on points. That is 7th place. Jack Tato is 8th overall in points, locked in on a win. So our top 8 drivers all know they'll be racing for a championship in the playoffs. Starting with the next driver and the first one not officially locked in, that is Streamer in 9th place. He is plus 37 right now, which is very solid. All he needs to do is qualify, and he'll be in the playoffs confirmed. Quillo is sitting in 10th, plus 27, really solid still for that 9 car, probably in regarding a disaster for Quillo in the final race. Then it gets interesting, the bottom half of the standings. Murakami is plus 15, and he just gained 4 spots in the points, passing up Confetti, Spitzer, Woodpecker, and Electro for the second to last spot into the playoffs, and really the first real vulnerable, but still 15 points above the cut line is pretty solid for Murakami. Just needs a good run and needs to just outdo the competitors who are behind him to get his way in. The final spot is a plus 10, and that is for Electro, who has not necessarily had a great second half of the season, and he finds himself in the last playoff spot right now over Woodpecker, who has dropped to 10 points out, dropped a spot after DNQing. Luckily for him, he didn't fall too far behind because Spitzer also DNQ'd, who is now 11 points out and still 1 point behind Woodpecker. Then we have Winx, and Winx moved up from 16th to now 15th and is just under 100 points total, 14 points out of the playoffs, and he's really been on a surge recently. Confetti actually drops 2 spots, even though he did make it out of the group stage. He's only 16 points out. He stayed completely even, and we're going to Confetti's best track, Mayhem Super Speedway, for the final race of the season. Nugget is sitting in 17th, minus 23. That's probably the first one where you're a little iffy on whether or not they can do it themselves. They'll need some help to get in on points. Sal is minus 27. Same situation for him, and he's been dropping recently. Now just ahead of 2 drivers, and those 2 drivers that he's ahead of must win race 8 to make the playoffs. They are mathematically eliminated. Mazzillo with 75 points has to win, And Prime, with 62 points on the season, is also a must-win going into the MSWP 500 from Mayhem.
Yeah, from my point of view, to me, Streamer and Quilla are kind of locked in as the 9 and 10 unless chaos happens. But it really seems like Nugget, Sal are kind of also in the must-win situation. Yes, they're not mathematically eliminated, but personally, I haven't really seen enough like speed from them or just close enough on points to really outpoint all of those people. So I feel they're kind of must-win as well, but really the last two spot goes from 11th to 16. Those are really the main six that I'm looking at in this final race to see who will get the last two spots.
Yeah, and then we had already, mentioned about him earlier. Winks with his late season charge. I believe he's made up around 25 points on the cutoff in these last two races, if I'm not mistaken. And that's an average of 12 and a half points per race. And he's currently sitting only 14 out. So he can theoretically do it. He just needs just a tiny bit more out of that car. I think if he could make it back to the final six, he can easily find those extra 2-3 points and make it in back into the playoffs.
Yeah, and if you look at what he did last weekend, he gained 8 points on the line with an 8th place finish. And what you said about getting to the final six, he gained a lot more when he made it all the way up to 4th. There's a kind of a big jump in points there. So if he can get into the final six, I think he certainly has a chance to make it in. He's, of course, going to be dependent on what happens ahead of him, but I certainly don't think you can count out Winks at this point in the season.
And we've definitely seen a lot of late season charges, like take for example Murakami last year, his teammate. So hey, history could repeat itself.
And we're going to head into a unique segment, something we have not done before. We're going to just ask some questions as we head into our regular season finale. There's some looming questions that need answers, and we want to see what our analysts think about them. Our first question is, will there be a new winner next weekend? We had 6 winners total last season. We are sitting on 5 this season. Do we see a new winner at Mayhem, Sham?
I think it is certainly possible that we will. Need beat it for maybe Quillo, as they had a very impressive run here at race 4, or maybe Streamer just because he's so dominant yet he hasn't had a single win yet, or maybe even Murakami, Confetti, or Winks, as Winks been hot. Murakami and Confetti are pretty solid at Mayhem. I think it's very easily that you could say a new winner will happen, especially with how chaotic Mayhem can be.
And looking at those drivers you just mentioned, 2 of them have wins here. We've run at this track 3 times. Obviously, the winner from earlier this year was Drizel. The 2 winners last year at this track have not won a race this season. Plus, you have Confetti, who's strong here. So I certainly think the ones that you mentioned definitely have a shot, and they have no less of a shot than anyone who has won earlier in this season. And Luke, what's your thought on this? Do you think we see a new winner?
Absolutely. I mean, you just said it. We have 5 different winners overall this season, but 4 of them have won their first career race in general. I mean, it's totally possible we get another new winner here. And like you just mentioned, the 2 previous winners, they haven't won yet, Streamer Murakami. You just mentioned Confetti, who is also very strong here. A 3rd place finish, a 4th place finish last year, even a 7th place finish this year. Very consistent. And I'm going to throw in 2 more names in the mix who could easily have a chance. Woodpecker, he finished 4th here in the first Mayhem race, also was a pole sitter. And even Nugget. Nugget's consistently strong at this track as well. Whenever he's strong somewhere, he's going to be aggressive. Look at what he did earlier on this year. He flat out wrecked Steve multiple times to try to beat him. Of course, it came to no avail. But if Nugget knows that he's good somewhere, he's going to try to take advantage of it.
Yeah, and of course, the interesting thing about it is the entire playoffs could be shaken up if it's somebody from below the line. A couple of those drivers you mentioned are. So it's definitely going to be interesting and one you don't want to miss next weekend. And speaking on, the playoffs shaking up, our next question is, who do you guys think claim the final two spots? We talked a little bit about during the current standings that Quillo and Streamer are probably both good on points. That leaves two positions open, currently held by Murakami and Electro. Luke, who do you think ends up either pointing their way in, winning their way in? Who's those last two spots?
Well, for me, I think the person who's got the best chance of making it in, first off, Murakami. I mean, Murakami is great at being very clutch. We've seen what he's done last year with the second place and a win. He's doing it again. He's got another second place coming off of Hyper just a while ago, and momentum is definitely on his side. He jumped up 4 spots in the points, and he's in a pretty good spot, being 15 points above the cutoff. My last one I have making in, it's a bit of a controversial one, even though his season's been quite up and down and very unpredictable. That kind of plays into where we're going to next. I think the last spot's going to go to Woodpecker. The last time that he came off of a DNQ, he not only tied his best finish of the season with ninth, but he followed that up with a third, even though he qualified in 18th. And like I mentioned before, Woodpecker does have a top 5 at Mayhem. He's had a very unpredictable year this year, whether being one really good race, just average, and just not even making the race at all. But because we're going to an unpredictable track, that's definitely going to play into Woodpecker's nature this year. So I think he might sneak in. So that means the first person I have out is Electro. I think Electro is the opposite of Woodpecker. Electro is also very unpredictable as well, but I think that works against him. Electro does have a second place finish here at Mayhem, which actually came this year, but he also has a DNQ, which happened last year. And in the last 3 races that we've just ran, Electro has a DNQ and 2 group stage eliminations. I physically cannot see how Electro can get out of this, considering the season he's had, especially very recently.
Yeah, I certainly agree with basically everything that you said with Murakami. I firmly stand that I do think he is a just a late race threat, and I would assume he'll at least get to like the final 6 in this race and lock himself in on points. But the last spot is really up for grabs. I think of the people I said from 11th to 16th, you can kind of rule out Spitzer. He's never really been that good at Mayhem. I see what Luke is saying, but I feel like it's a bit too much of a variable to really pick him. So my thoughts come down to Electro, Winks, and Confetti. Confetti being really strong here, but he's been just absolute choke fetty throughout a lot of the recent races and messing up a lot of things. So like I would want to assume that he could get his way in, but it makes me question it. So it's like a potential Confetti, but I honestly think it could be between Winks or Electro. As Luke said when you were here last time, he had a second place finish. So I feel like this is a different Electro from last year, where he ended up DNQing once at Mayhem. And Winks is on the hot right now, so I think it's also a chance that he might be able to join Murakami in getting the last spot. So I can't really say a definitive last place. It really has to come down to the race, but I think the most likely is Electro and Winks, and then just behind them being Confetti.
And you also got to take into account that when that DNQ happened last year for Electro, he was already locked in because he had won the previous race. So don't know how much that plays into it necessarily, but he was already locked in. It wasn't a super pressure packed situation, and we've seen him come up in the clutch, and he made the final 3 in the playoffs last year. But I think it's crazy that everyone who's being talked about right now were all playoff drivers last year, and they're all fighting for a couple spots. And there's going to be several drivers who made the playoffs last year that are not going to be there this year. And it's hard to make an argument against most of these drivers like Confetti, because Confetti was in a spot very similar to how he was how he is last year, and he got in. So it's hard to make an argument against him, but it's also hard to argue against Murakami or Electro. So I definitely think that it's going to be unpredictable, and it's going to be interesting to watch for sure. And our final question doesn't relate necessarily directly to the next race, but more looking towards the playoffs. Somebody who is already locked in, and we spoke about him a little bit. The next question is Earl a legitimate championship contender? Sham, what is your stance on Earl? Do you think he could potentially be an underdog, like legitimate underdog champion?
Honestly, I don't really think so. I think I think it's a good chance he will make it into the final six at to get into the actual playoffs at the end, but I just don't really see him winning the entire thing. Even though he has made it to 3 of the finals, and he did, it was very impressive, a sweep in one of them, but in the other two, he ended up getting in. I think it was a third and then a tied second, only getting 2 of the required 4 heat wins. So, I mean, if it was more threes or like very close losses, I would maybe be a bit more certain on it, but I kind of see him as a final 6 elimination.
Well, I mean, I'm inclined to say that Earl is definitely a championship contender. I mean, ever since his win, he has not stopped. He actually beats Drizel in almost every major statistical category. The only one that he doesn't beat him in is average qualifying, and both of them have an 8.0 average qualifying. But Earl has 13 heat wins in the last 2 races since his race win, and Drizel has only 7. Earl also has 2 top 5 finishes, that being a fifth and a third, and Drizel has none. And we always talk about how Drizel was an early championship favorite when he won 2 races and being the most winningest driver so far. But why don't we talk about Earl when he has better stats than Drizel so far? Drizel has we've seen taken a bit of a step back. I mean, I don't know if it's he's saving his energy, his equipment for the playoffs, or we don't know. But you would think that even after you win a race, you want to get as much points as possible so that way you can have a better seeding for the playoffs. And Earl is doing just that. He's going out there and beating Drizel on a race by race basis. So I do think Earl is a championship contender right now.
I think that's a little harsh to be saying that Earl is just outright better than Drizel. I personally haven't looked at the exact stats in recency, but if you at least look at season 1 and at least the first 4 races of this season, Drizel obviously dominates Earl in all of the rest of the stats. So again, as I said, I think Earl has been very good recently, but I don't think it's the champion of season 2 quality, to be honest.
Well, yeah, I don't think, Earl is outright better than Drizel, but I just think Earl is in a way better position than what he was at the start of the year. I mean, we thought that he was the fourth best on the team, but no, it's very evident that he's now taking the helm of very likely the second best driver on the team. And actually, I just went back on this. He was 43 points behind Drizel after he won his first race. And as of right now, that lead has been cut down to 24 points. So Earl has made up quite a bit of progress on the points lead. He's made up 19 points over the last 2 races. So although it's still kind of a tall order to fill to try to cut down a 24-point lead to overtake Drizel for the points lead with only 1 race to go, but the fact that Earl has been able to hunt down his teammate, I think is something that you can't overlook.
Well, it'll certainly be interesting to watch to see how Earl's season unfolds as we go towards the playoffs. I think it's interesting that you both were kind of comparing him to Le Mans Drizel, where I think everyone was being compared to Streamer last year, and then Oak comes out of nowhere and wins the championship. So you really don't know, but I was curious to see what your thoughts were on him, as he's been pretty under the radar this season. And the final thing we got to do this episode, as always, we will end on our race picks, and it's our final regular season race picks of this season, season 2. We are heading back to Mayhem Super Speedway, as we've been talking about, for the MSWP 500, the regular season finale. It's going to be crazy, but I want to know who you guys think's going to win. Luke, who is your favorite to win this weekend at Mayhem?
Well, I was going back and forth over at the first Mayhem race, and I picked Mozilla for that one, but I'm gonna go with my backup favorite this time, and I'm gonna go with Steve. And Steve kind of really proved that he was probably the better pick to go, but it's very hard to count against him. He's had a very great season this year, and coming off of a finale appearance in the first Mayhem race, I just don't see how you can count against him. He's been very fast. He's garnered a lot of poles this year, and he was able to survive against the chaotic Nugget in his matchup, where Nugget would consistently try to run him off the track. Just a very calm, cool, collected Steve, and I think he has the potential to do that again, but this time win.
Yeah, and Steve, like you said, he's been on a real hot streak here, 2 poles in a row. Obviously, the first one didn't go the way he wanted, but he's had 2 finals appearances this year. It's been a strong year for Steve, and so we'll see if he can close out the season with his first career win. And Sham, who is your favorite to win this week?
I think this will come to absolutely zero shock from Hershey and Luke, but it has to go for Murakami. I was such a massive fan of what he ended up pulling up in the 8th race of season 1, and just now seeing that he comes off of his best uh, race this year and getting a second place, I think that spells all you need to see on the board there, that this is going to be a great race for Murakami, and he definitely should be getting to the final 6, might be getting to the final 3, and getting once again a last second win to absolutely clinch himself into the finals.
Yeah, the question that everyone is asking right now is, will history continue to repeat itself? He won this race last year after finishing second in the 7th race. So he's done the first half. Can he pull off the second half again? But here's where it gets interesting. Our underdog picks. These are probably some wild cards, maybe some who are under the line for the playoffs and could potentially win their way into the playoffs, like Murakami did last season. Luke, who do you have as your underdog winner for this weekend?
So going into Mayhem, you have so many people who people talk about doing well. You have your woodpeckers, your nuggets, your confettis, and even your Murakamis. But there's one rogue element that we all just seem to forget. So I think Sal is gonna be that rogue element and throw a wrench into everything. We can't overlook Sal's stats here from last year. He had a 4.5 qualifying average. In the first Mayhem race, he unfortunately DNF'd in both of the laps during the group stage. I mean, I just don't put that on him. Mayhem is just chaotic as always, so that wasn't really his fault. But the second Mayhem race, he had a lot of really uh, good matchups. He was against Jack Tato in the final 12, and he was up against Steve in the final 6, and both of those drivers were, considerably worse than what they are this year. So he was able to get to the finale in that race and up until he finished on the podium. And what's interesting to note is he was the last driver in on points going into that Mayhem race and was only 3 points above the cutoff. And the eventual winner of that race was below it. So Sal needed to perform one way or another. It's just he was now forced into that situation when a driver from below the cutoff won the race. And he did just that. He vaulted ahead of Quillo and Earl and knocked them both out of the playoff picture, while he and Murakami were the ones to sneak in. As of right now, it doesn't look really good for Sal, being 27 points out of the cutoff right now. But on that Mayhem race, he gained over 20 to 25 points on both Quillo and Earl that race. And like I said for Winks, where he gained about an average of 12.5 points in the last two races, Sal gaining 20 to 25 points that year and him being 27 points out right now, it kind of lines up. You need a little bit of luck to go your way at Mayhem, and I think that four-leaf clover on Sal's car might just come in handy.
And that'd be huge, obviously, for Sal. Like we said, even though you made the argument for points, 27 is a lot to make up. A lot would have to go his way, and if he wins, nothing else has to happen. He would do it himself. So that would certainly be a fascinating walk-off win to get into playoffs for Sal. And Sham, well, this is it. This is the final pick of the regular season. Who is your underdog pick to win the final race of season 2?
This might come as controversial or surprising, but my pick, it will be going to Chokefetti. Even though I just called him Chokefetti, he is amazing at Mayhem, doing very well in season 1 and did very solid here the first time we came here. But I think the choke might stop here. Wouldn't that be very poetic if he's just been messing up over and over throughout all these races, but when it comes down to the wire, when it counts, we just see Confetti kill it at one of his best tracks. I think that would be a poetic way for it to end, and him maybe ending up sniping that final spot or just doing enough to point in as he's not that far out.
Yeah, and that would certainly relieve the tension that has been between all the Confetti fans and really all of the MSPN fans in general, who are just so upset for Confetti in the season as how it's unfolded for him, because you look at it and he's only 16 points out right now, and he's probably left more than 16 points on the table in the last 3 or 4 races with his mistakes that he's made. So going to certainly his best track, he needs to put on the performance of his life to get in. And if he could pull off his first career win, that would certainly be a great way to erase all those mistakes from earlier in the season. And next up is qualifying for the MSWP 500, the regular season finale of NASMARB Season 2. Qualifying is tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Time right here on MSPN. You're going to want to tune in. It's going to be a critical qualifying session to set up our final race of the year, the MSWP 500 from Mayhem Super Speedway. So like I said, qualifying is tonight at 7 Eastern. Tomorrow at 7 Eastern is the race, and the playoff field will be set after that. But for now, that's all for us here in the studio. We will see you after the season finale for our playoff predictions. But until then, we will see you at the track.